All right, let's jump right in. We're going to talk about a story that is honestly one of the most powerful and moving accounts of interfaith encounter in all of early Islamic history. I mean, it's got everything: persecution, a desperate search for refuge, and this just profound moment of connection between early Muslims and Christians.
I mean, just listen to that quote. Verily, these words and what Moses brought forth come from the same source. Wow, that line, supposedly spoken by a Christian king after hearing the Quran recited, that's the absolute core of this whole story, right? It's this incredible moment of recognition, this idea of a shared heritage that's just resonated for centuries.
It's a beautiful, powerful story of respect. But, and you knew there was a but coming, right? Here's where things get really fascinating. When historians started digging into the details, really looking closely, the timeline gets, well, messy. And that messiness, that historical puzzle, is exactly what we're going to unpack.
Okay, so first things first. Before we get into the puzzle, let's make sure we're all on the same page. Let's run through the traditional account, the story that many of us know and have heard for, well, over 1,000 years.
So picture this, right? The early Muslims are facing intense persecution back in Mecca. So a small group of them flees across the sea, seeking refuge in the Christian kingdom of Abyssinia, what we now know as Ethiopia. But the persecutors, they're not giving up. They send a delegation to the court of the Christian king, Najashi, and demand he hand over the refugees. It's this incredibly tense moment. And in the middle of it all, one of the refugees, a man named Jafar, stands up and recites verses from the Quran, specifically about Jesus and Mary. And the story goes that the king and his court were so moved, they literally started crying. They saw the truth in those words and immediately granted the Muslims protection. It's just an amazing story of compassion.
But, history is almost never that neat and tidy. And as beautiful as that story is, when modern historians started lining up all the different accounts, they found some pretty significant cracks in the narrative. Yeah, it's like the pieces of the puzzle just don't quite fit. You've got different sources giving conflicting details about when this all happened, what was actually recited, and even who was in the room. It's a classic historical whodunit, or maybe a whendunit, and we've got to figure out what's going on.
So look at this. On one side, you have the traditional story, right? It all happens around 615 CE, right after they arrive. But then you have these other reports, and they're suggesting it happened way later, maybe even after the Battle of Badr. And it's not just the timing. Some accounts say it was Surah Maryam that was recited, but others mention completely different chapters. And the whole reason for the meeting seems to change, from a desperate plea for help to something more like a formal diplomatic get-together. These are not small details, They totally change the flavor of the story.
So the big question is, how on earth do you solve a mystery that's 1,400 years old? Well, you need a new kind of detective tool, and that's exactly what researchers are using, a really powerful method for sorting through all this conflicting historical evidence. It's called the integrative approach, and honestly, the best way to think about it is like a modern CSI investigation. A detective isn't going to solve a case by just talking to one witness, right? No way! They're going to collect everything. Forensics, interviews, surveillance footage, the whole shebang. Well, this method does the same thing for history. It gathers every available narrative, from religious texts, historical accounts, you name it, to try and build the most complete 360-degree view of what actually happened.
So how does it work in practice? It's actually pretty logical. Step 1, you gather all the narratives, every single report, every mention, no matter where it comes from. Step 2, you cross-reference the details. You lay everything out and see where the stories line up and where they clash. Who was there? When did it happen? What was said? And then, step 3, you reconstruct the event. Based on where all the evidence converges, you build a new, much stronger timeline. You're not just picking your favorite story, you're letting all the clues guide you to a better one.
And this is where it gets really, really cool, because when researchers applied this very method to the story of the king and the refugees, a completely new timeline started to emerge, and believe me, it is a total game changer. All right, you ready for this? Here's the big reveal. Once you analyze all those different reports together, a new sequence of events becomes crystal clear. That famous, dramatic recitation, it didn't happen right after the first migration, not even close.
What the evidence actually points to are two separate encounters. So yes, the first migration happened around 615 CE, and the Muslims were given some initial protection. But that big dramatic confrontation in the king's court, the one with the delegation from Mecca and Jafar's famous recitation, that appears to have happened way, way later, around 628 CE, when the Muslim community was much more established back in Medina.
12 years later, I mean, think about that. This isn't just a minor date correction. It's a gap of more than a decade. We've basically been compressing two separate events, a whole 12 years apart, into one single moment.
Okay, so at this point you're probably thinking, so what? 12 years? What's the big deal? Well, it is a huge deal. This timeline shift doesn't just change a history book entry, it has massive implications for how we understand the history of the Quran itself. This right here shows the biggest impact. For centuries, the thinking was that Surah Maryam, the chapter about Mary, must have been revealed very early, in Mecca, almost as if to prepare the Muslims for their encounter in a Christian land. It makes sense, right? But if that famous recitation actually happened in 628 CE, it means the surah itself was most likely revealed much, much later, during the Medinan period of the Prophet's mission. So think about what this changes. First, the Quranic timeline. It potentially moves a major, beloved chapter from the early Meccan period all the way to the later Medinan period. Second, the context of the dialogue. This wasn't a conversation between a fledgling group of refugees and the king. It was a much more mature theological exchange happening when the Muslim community was stronger and more established. And third, it transforms the historical narrative from a single event into a long-term relationship. It suggests that the engagement between the early Muslims and this Christian kingdom wasn't just a one-off plea for help, but a sustained, evolving relationship over many years.
So where does this leave us? What's the big takeaway here? I think it's important to say that the story of the king and the refugees is still just as powerful. It's still incredibly moving. In fact, you could argue it's even richer and more complex now. Because this isn't about debunking a beautiful story. Not at all. It's about showing how our understanding of the past is always growing, always evolving. New methods, like this integrative approach, give us the tools to see a much bigger picture, a more accurate and, frankly, more interesting one. History isn't some dusty old book that's already written. It's a living puzzle, and we're always finding new pieces.
And that really leaves us with one final big question to think about. If a story this foundational, this well-known, can be completely reframed just by looking at all the clues, what other historical certainties are out there just waiting for a second look? It makes you wonder, right? What else is out there for us to discover?